Jared here from the Heel to the Face podcast. And in 2018, I made a YouTube video for the 10 places WWE should host WrestleMania and which hasn't hosted WrestleMania before. Number 1 on that list, Tampa, Florida, and Raymond James Stadium. I even mentioned the theme of the Buccaneers of the NFL being tied in with the grandest stage of them all being used for the set design, the stage, the graphics, and WWE in 2020 made that prediction a reality and in still my eyes one of the best cities that could possibly host the granddaddy of them all for WWE. But unfortunately, we all know what 2020 brought. The event got canceled, and in 2021, we got a much scaled-down version of the party and the excitement that WWE was about to bring to Tampa, Florida. So I hope today, on my revised list of 10 places that should host WrestleMania that haven't before, number 1 on my list doesn't get so cursed. Quickly, just a few little rules is that I'm picking places that are realistic, places that WWE would and could bring WrestleMania. So no Bristol Motor Speedways or the big house in Ann Arbor, because it's not just about the venues themselves that host WrestleMania, but about the city being the host city for the biggest show of WWE's calendar year. An honorable mention, San Diego, California. San Diego's hosted Super Bowls, and without a doubt, it is a great city to host any big event. The problem here, though, is that San Diego is currently without a proper venue to host WrestleMania. Qualcomm Stadium, the former home of the Chargers, has been torn down and replaced with a stadium that holds about 35,000 people. Now, they've talked about in the future expanding that for potential NFL use, but as of right now, a 35,000 seat football stadium and a 45,000 seat baseball stadium are the biggest venues in San Diego, California, so it doesn't make my top 10 list. Number 10, Montreal, Quebec, Canada. We just saw the excitement of Elimination Chamber at the Bell Center in Montreal, Quebec, Canada, one of the biggest arenas in North America and a place that could easily host SmackDown, the Hall of Fame, the Raw after WrestleMania, and there is no doubt that WWE has the excitement and the fan power behind Montreal. Being so close to cities like New York and Boston, it could draw in from all around the Northeast. But number 10 on my list because of the venue they would need for WrestleMania, and that is Olympic Stadium. It is not a great stadium by any stretch of the imagination. In fact, the Canadian Football League Montreal Alouettes and the MLS Montreal Impact no longer use that stadium as their main homes because it is pretty much past its prime. It was in 2004, that's almost 20 years ago, that the Montreal Expos moved out of Olympic Stadium, and they haven't had a permanent tenant since. WWE can make stadiums look great that don't necessarily look great with camera works and lighting, but unfortunately, Olympic Stadium in Montreal might just be a little bit too old and a little too outdated to host WrestleMania. That's why it falls at number 10 on my list. Number 9, another Canadian city, Vancouver, British Columbia. BC Place in Vancouver, British Columbia is a nice indoor dome that's the home of the Canadian Football League's British Columbia Lions and was home of a Winter Olympics opening ceremony just about 10 years ago. The reason Vancouver, though, sits so far back on my list is because of its limited capacity at BC Place. A stadium that once hosted over 60 to 70,000 people has now been shrunken down to the high 50,000s, and with WrestleMania's set and stage design would draw probably in the 50,000 range. Now, one benefit of WrestleMania now being 2 nights is that WWE has the opportunity to use some smaller stadiums if they can draw them twice. For example, WWE wouldn't want to get 50,000 for WrestleMania in the past if it was a one-night event, but 2 nights they might accommodate it. And Rogers Place, which is an arena in downtown Vancouver, could easily accommodate and host WWE Raw after WrestleMania, the Hall of Fame ceremony, and there's so much to do and there's so much to see in Vancouver that other wrestling companies would be glad and happy to go to the Pacific Northwest and Vancouver, British Columbia for a WrestleMania in the future. Number 8 on my list, Cleveland, Ohio, and First Energy Stadium. Now, again, this falls very low on my list because it's a cold weather city. And yes, we're about to have our second cold weather city host to WrestleMania and WrestleMania 40 in Philadelphia, with MetLife Stadium in New York hosting 2 in the past. But unfortunately, outside of the Northeast and big places like Philadelphia and New York City, Cleveland just doesn't have that appeal to weather the storm. Now, Cleveland is a great city, home of the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame, and home of so many reasons why WWE would want to host the big event in Cleveland, Ohio. It has got much more cachet than the bigger cities in Ohio, Columbus and Cincinnati, but it's still an outdoor city, and First Energy Stadium, while it would be big enough, might just be a little too cold in the early parts of April and late parts of March to host WrestleMania. But the city itself, I think, is on WWE's radar. They've hosted many pay-per-views there, from Survivor Series to SummerSlam. Maybe WrestleMania? Only time would tell. Number 7, Minneapolis, Minnesota. Now, Minneapolis, Minnesota may not be the sexiest city, but thanks to US Bank Stadium, they have hosted all the big events. Super Bowl, Final Four, they've all come to Minneapolis, Minnesota. The biggest city in the state of Minnesota has the perfect indoor stadium to host WrestleMania. You have multiple venues, whether it be the Target Center in downtown Minneapolis or the XL Energy Center in St. Paul, Minneapolis, to host the Raw after and the SmackDown before WrestleMania, or use one of the other venues to host Ring of Honor, Impact Wrestling, New Japan. And when it comes to convention centers, they've got it all. So outside of just WWE coming to town, Minneapolis, Minnesota has all the proper hotels, all the proper venues to bring WrestleMania and all the pro wrestling world into Minneapolis, Minnesota, the former hub and home of AWA. Number 6 on my list, Kansas City, Missouri, and the home of the Kansas City Chiefs, Arrowhead Stadium. Now, this shows up a little higher on my list than Cleveland, Ohio, but also could suffer from a little bit of cold weather action going on in the middle of April and early parts of March. But Kansas City is a great city to host a big event. No, they haven't hosted a Super Bowl because, again, it gets cold there in January. They could, though, get in a WrestleMania in the early parts of spring. Kansas City itself as a city can host big time events. They're home of the Royals. They're home of the Chiefs. And, well, we all know that that stadium is known for getting loud. And without a doubt, I think Kansas City could host 2 nights of WrestleMania. You still have many arenas such as the Sprint, now T-Mobile Center in downtown Kansas City, and even the Kemper Arena with all of its bad mojo of WWF past and WCW past and that to be added. But Kansas City has enough venues and enough hotels and enough cachet to host the biggest event of the WWE calendar year. Number 5 on my list, Memphis, Tennessee. Now, I was going back and forth between Memphis and Nashville, and obviously Nashville is the bigger city, a city I'm surprised actually hasn't hosted a Super Bowl yet, because while it does get chilly in January, it's still a city that's got so much going for it that you think they would give them the New York City treatment. But when it comes to late March and early April, I think the state of Tennessee is more than warm enough to host a WrestleMania outdoors. Now, the stadium that would host in Memphis is the Liberty Bowl, and unlike the Titan Stadium in Nashville, it is a little bit on the smaller side, and it is a little outdated. It gets about a 60,000 capacity when it is as full as can be, so each night of WrestleMania would probably draw in the high 50s. They are about to get an upgrade at the Liberty Bowl, as well as having many venues to use throughout the city of Memphis, and we all know about Jerry the King Lawler and his ties to Memphis, Tennessee, and the great wrestling history that belongs in Memphis, Tennessee. So I can imagine that going to Memphis for WrestleMania would hop up Beale Street like something you've never seen. The FedEx Forum could host a week of WWE activities. There still is the Mid-South Coliseum right next to the Liberty Bowl that could host some outside WWE events, and there would just be so much going on. Memphis is not a huge city, but it is a party city, and I think it could be home to WWE's biggest event of the year. Number 4, London, England. Now, Obviously, this was going to show up on my list. London, England has never hosted a WrestleMania. They've hosted a big-time SummerSlam. They're about to host Money in the Bank. And WWE is showing that they want to do more international shows. And if you had to pick anywhere international, even though they're going to London a lot as of late, it's still got to be London. And part of the reason is because they are the closest city that can appeal to the Americanized time zones. Because WrestleMania, as we've seen, is still an Americanized event, and everything needs to be catered to the American eyeballs back in North America. Now, in London, a 7 o'clock start would be a 1 o'clock in the afternoon start here Eastern time, and probably around 10 or 9 o'clock in the morning West Coast time. Now, if you were to go somewhere like Australia or Japan, the timings are insane. We're talking, if you know Wrestle Kingdom, like 5 o'clock in the morning. And WWE, despite the fact that they would draw a great crowd in Australia or Japan, isn't going to have their biggest event of the calendar year at 5 o'clock in the morning and 2 o'clock in the morning in Eastern and Pacific time zones here in the United States. London, though, on the other hand, they could still have it in the same day, the same afternoon, and it would be just enough of an appeal. In London, obviously, is a huge city, a huge wrestling city, and we've seen them already draw 80,000 in the past for a SummerSlam. We already saw Money in the Bank tickets go right out the door as soon as they went on sale. Without a doubt, there would be no issues and no trouble with selling out any stadium, specifically Wembley Stadium in London, UK, and they obviously have all the venues and all the hotels of a major city to host the Olympics and maybe even a future Super Bowl. But as for this list, a future WrestleMania. Number 3 on my list, Washington, D.C. Now, I know FedEx Field is probably one of the worst stadiums in the National Football League, but one thing about WWE is they don't have the same criterias that the NFL does. We all saw that when they hosted the WrestleManias at the Citrus Bowl, a Citrus Bowl that essentially sat dormant and in the upper decks didn't even have chairback seatings and still to this day just has bench seatings. But WWE knows that their big event isn't normally catering to celebrities and buying up luxury suites, but to the general population who buys general seating areas, as we saw in Orlando and as we saw in other places that WWE has hosted WrestleMania. So while FedEx Field may not be worthy of hosting a Super Bowl and may not be worthy of housing celebrities and all of their luxury suites, it is a stadium that can hold upwards of 70,000 people, and it is a stadium that is located in Washington, D.C., right between D.C. and Baltimore, two of the biggest cities in the United States, and only about a 3.5-hour drive from New York City. So the entire corridor of the Northeast would descend on the United States Capitol. I could see the themes now. We saw it with Capitol Carnage when WWE used Washington, D.C. as a pay-per-view many years ago. I could see Washington, D.C. being home to a WrestleMania. They've got the convention centers, they've got the hotels, they've got the exterior venues, they've got the entire beltway at its corridor. So you could see Ring of Honor and AEW hosting shows as far away as Baltimore and still being considered to be in that area, because we saw it with Orlando and Ring of Honor hosting shows in Lakeland, which is about 30 minutes away from Orlando. Well, Baltimore is actually only about 25 minutes away from FedEx Field. So both Baltimore and Washington could essentially combine to host this one event, with events for WrestleMania spreading out between the two cities, but FedEx Field being the home for WrestleMania in the future. Number 2 on my list is kind of a cheating answer because they have already hosted a WrestleMania. I'm talking Las Vegas, Nevada. Now, Las Vegas, Nevada hosted WrestleMania 9 at Caesars Palace, but the WWE/WWF was a much different animal back in 1993 when they hosted WrestleMania in front of about 10,000 people at Caesars Palace. And now they've got Allegiant Stadium. Now they have the mass appeal of hosting Final Fours, hosting Super Bowls, having an NFL and NHL team, and probably in the future MLB and NBA teams at their disposal. Las Vegas, without a doubt, has the hotel space, without a doubt, has the exterior venues. And we saw all this when SummerSlam was hosted at Allegiant Stadium in 2021. They didn't use the whole venue, but they used Allegiant Stadium, which I think they could fill to the core. And I think maybe SummerSlam 2001 was just a test run to see if they can draw big time for a WrestleMania. The downside right now for Las Vegas, though, is trying to push too hard on Las Vegas. We saw that with 2021 and filling up the stadium halfway for SummerSlam, getting over 50,000. Great. But they tried to do too much, and they came back the following year for Money in the Bank. Unfortunately, they couldn't draw another 50,000 and had to move inside MGM Grand. But for WrestleMania, especially if you give it some time between events in Las Vegas, and with WrestleMania upcoming to be in Los Angeles, you probably want to give it maybe 2 or 3 years before you return to the West Coast. But Las Vegas, Allegiant Stadium with proper build, could easily be home to a WrestleMania. And number 1 on my list, Charlotte, North Carolina. Wrestling and Charlotte go hand in hand. Charlotte obviously is the city in which Ric Flair's daughter is kayfabe named after. It is a big-time wrestling city, and downtown they have Bank of America Stadium. And yet I've heard from NFL fans it is not one of the best, if it's maybe one of the worst in the National Football League. But again, WWE doesn't have the same criterias as the NFL does when they're picking places to host Super Bowls. They do draw similar crowds, but they don't sell a lot of luxury suites, premium packages, and where celebrities and other massive A-list people come to town. WrestleMania is an event that caters to fans who buy tickets, fans who sit in general seating. And essentially, WWE just wants a place that looks good on TV when they've decorated it up. And easily, WWE could decorate up Bank of America Stadium with no problem. The Spectrum Center exists in Charlotte, North Carolina to be home for SmackDowns and Raws bookending WrestleMania weekend. There's obviously still Bojangles Coliseum that has hosted many WCW pay-per-views in the past that could clearly host any other companies trying to come in. And there's the convention centers, and there's just so much around Charlotte, North Carolina, and pretty good weather at the end of March and early parts of April that mean that this city, the city that essentially Ric Flair and WCW put on the map, could be the home for WWE's biggest event. They host big-time NASCAR there. They host big-time NBA, big-time NFL. Charlotte, North Carolina, I think, is the number 1 pick for a city to host WrestleMania that has never hosted WrestleMania before. What do you think of my list? Leave a comment below and tell me where you think WWE should host a WrestleMania that hasn't hosted it before. Maybe pick a city they've been to, but a venue they have not. This has been Jared for the Heel to the Face podcast.